everyone. We are back with our main read, A Little Princess. And I have my partner in crime,
Ash.
to join me. And we are reading chapter 18, I Tried Not to Be.
It was pretty comfortable, Mrs. Carmichael, who explained everything. She sent for once and came across the square to take Sarah into her warm arms and make it clear all that had happened. The excitement of the totally unexpected discovery had been temporarily almost overpowering to Mr. Carstford in his weak condition.
Upon my word,
He said faintly to Mr. Carmichael when it was suggested that the little girl should go into the other room.
I feel as if I do not want to lose sight of her,
"I'll take care of her,
Janet said.
and Mama will come in a few minutes.
And it was Janet who led her away.
We're so glad you're found,
She said.
and you don't know how glad we are that you are found."
Donald stood with his hands in his pockets and gazed at Sarah with reflecting and self-reproachful eyes.
"If I just asked what your name was when I gave you my 6 pence,
He said.
you could have told me it was Sarah Crewe, and then you should have been found in a minute."
And then Miss Carmichael came in, and she looked very much moved, and suddenly took Sarah in her arms and kissed her.
"You look bewildered, poor child,
She said.
and it is not to be wondered at.
Sarah could only think of one thing.
Was he...
She said, with a glance toward the door of the closed library.
Was he the wicked friend? Oh, do tell me."
Miss Carmichael was crying as she kissed her again, and she felt as if she ought to be kissed very often, because she had not been kissed for so long.
"He was not wicked, my dear.
He answered.
He did not really lose your papa's money. He only thought he had lost it, and because he loved him so much, his grief made him so ill that for a time he was not in his right mind. He almost died of brain fever, and then long before he began to recover it, your poor papa was dead,"
And he did not know where to find me.
murmured Sarah.
And I was so near.
Somehow she could not forget that she had been so near.
He believed you were in a school in France,
Miss Carmichael explained.
and he was continuously misled by false clues. He has looked for you everywhere, and when he saw you pass by, looking so sad and neglected, he did not dream you were his friends, poor child. But because you were a little girl too, he was sorry for you, and he wanted to make you happier, and he told Ram Dass to climb into your attic and try to make you as comfortable as possible.
Sarah gave a start of joy. Her whole look changed.
Did Ram Dass bring those things?
She cried out.
Did he tell Ram Dass to do it? Did he make the dream come true?
"Yes, my dear, yes. He is kind and good, and he was sorry for you for little lost Sarah Crewe's sake."
The library door opened, and Mr. Carmichael appeared, calling Sarah to him with a gesture.
"Mr. Carstford is better already.
He said.
He wants you to come to him."
Sarah did not wait. The Indian gentleman looked at her as she entered, and he saw that her face was all alight. She went and stood before his chair, with her hands clasped together against her breast.
"You sent the things to me.
She said in a joyful, emotional little voice.
The beautiful, beautiful things. You sent them."
Yes, poor child, poor dear child, I did.
He answered her. He was weak and broken with long illness and troubled, but he looked at her with the look she remembered in her father's eyes, the look of loving her and wanting to take her in his arms. It made her kneel down by him just as she used to kneel by her father when they were the dearest friends and lovers to the world.
When it is you who are my friend,
She said,
it is you who are my friend.
and she dropped her face on his thin hand and kissed it again and again.
This man will be himself again in 3 weeks.
Mr. Carmichael said to his wife.
Look at his face already.
In fact, he did look changed. Here was the little missus, and he had new things to think of and plan for ready. In the first place, there was Miss Minchin. She must be interviewed and told of the change which had taken place in the fortunes of her pupil. Sarah was not to return to the seminary at all. The Indian gentleman was very determined upon that point. She must remain where she was, and Mr. Carmichael should go and see Mrs. Minchin herself.
I am glad I need not go back,
said Sarah.
She will be very angry. She does not like me, though perhaps it is my fault, because I do not like her.
But oddly enough, Miss Minchin made it unnecessary for Mr. Carmichael to go to her, by actually coming in search of her pupil herself. She had wanted Sarah for something, and on inquiry had found and heard an astonishing thing. One of the housemaids had seen her steal out of the area with something hidden under her cloak, and had also seen her go up the stairs of the next door and enter the house.
What does she mean?
Cried Miss Minchin to Miss Amelia.
I'm sure I don't know, sister,
answered Miss Amelia.
Unless she has made friends with him because he has lived in India.
It would just be like her to thrust herself upon him and try to gain his sympathies in such impotent fashion,
said Miss Minchin.
She has been in the house for 2 hours. I will not allow such presumption. I shall go and inquire into the matter and apologize for her intrusion.
Sarah was sitting on the footstool close to Mr. Carrisford's knee, and listening to some of the many things he felt necessary to try and explain to her, when Ramadas announced the visitor's arrival. Sarah rose involuntarily and became rather pale, but Mr. Carrisford saw that she stood quietly and showed none of the ordinary signs of child terror. Miss Minchin entered the room in a stern, dignified manner. She was correctly and well dressed and rigidly polite.
I am sorry to disturb Mr. Carrisford,
she said,
but I have explanations to make. I am Miss Minchin, the proprietress of the young ladies' seminary next door.
The Indian gentleman looked at her for a moment in silent scrutiny. He was a man who had naturally a rather hot temper, and he did not wish it to get the better of him.
So you are Miss Minchin,
he said.
I am, sir.
In that case,
the Indian gentleman replied,
you have arrived at the right time. My solicitor, Mr. Carmichael, was just on the point of going to see you.
Mr. Carmichael bowed slightly, and Miss Minchin looked from him to Mr. Carrisford in amazement.
Your solicitor?
She said.
I do not understand. I have come here on a matter of duty. I have just discovered that you have been intruded upon through the forwardness of one of my pupils, a charity pupil. I came to explain that she intruded without my knowledge.
She turned upon Sarah.
Go home at once,
she commanded indignantly.
You shall be severely punished. Go home at once.
The Indian gentleman drew Sarah to his side and patted her hand.
She's not going.
Miss Minchin felt rather she was losing her senses.
Not going?
She repeated.
No,
said Mr. Carrisford.
She is not going home. If you give your house that name, her home for the future will be with me.
Miss Minchin fell back in amazed indignation.
With you? With you, sir? What does that mean?
Kindly explain the matter, Carmichael,
said the Indian gentleman,
and get it over as quickly as possible.
And he made Sarah sit back down again, and held her hand in his, which was another trick of her papa's. Then Mr. Carmichael explained in a quiet, level-toned, steady manner of a man who knew his subjects and all its legal significance, which was a thing Miss Minchin understood as a businesswoman and did not enjoy.
Mr. Carrisford, madam,
he said,
was an intimate friend of the late Captain Crewe. He was his partner in a certain large investments. The fortune which Captain Crewe supposed he had lost has been recovered, and is now in Mr. Carrisford's hands.
The fortune?
Cried Miss Minchin, and she really lost colour as she uttered the exclamation.
Sarah's fortune?
It will be Sarah's fortune,
replied Mr. Carmichael rather coldly.
It is Sarah's fortune now. In fact, certain events have increased it enormously. The diamond mines have retrieved themselves.
Diamond mines?
Miss Minchin gasped out. If this was true, nothing so horrible, she felt, had it ever happened to her since she was born.
The diamond mines?
Mr. Carmichael repeated, and could not help adding with a rather sly, unlawyer-like smile.
There are not many princesses, Miss Minchin, who are rather rich than your little charity pupil, Sarah Crewe, will be. Mr. Carrisford has been searching for her for nearly 2 years. At last he has found her, and he will keep her.
At which he asked Miss Minchin to sit down while he explained matters to her fully, and went into such detail so it was necessary to make it quite clear that Sarah's fortune was an assured one, and one that had seemed to be lost was to be restored to her tenfold. Also, that she had in Mr. Carstford a guardian as well as a friend. Miss Minchin was not a very clever woman, and in her excitement was silly enough to make one desperate effort to regain what she could not help seeing as she had lost through her worldly folly.
He found her under my care.
She protested.
I have done everything for her, but for me she would have starved in the streets.
Here the Indian gentleman lost his temper.
As to starving in the streets,
He said,
she might have starved more comfortably there than in your attic,
Captain Crewe left her in my charge,
argued Miss Minchin.
She must return to it until she is of age. She can be a parlour boarder again. She must finish her education. The law will interfere in my behalf.
Come, Miss Minchin,
Mr. Carmichael imposed.
the law will do nothing of the sort. If Sarah herself wishes to return to you, I dare say Mr. Carrisford might not refuse to allow it, but that rests with Sarah.
Then,
said Miss Minchin,
I appeal to Sarah. I have not spoiled you, perhaps,
she said awkwardly to the little girl,
but you know that your papa was pleased with your progress, and I have always been fond of you.
Sarah's grey-green eyes fixed themselves on her with quite clear look Miss Minchin particularly disliked.
Have you, Miss Minchin?
She said.
I did not know that.
Miss Minchin reddened and drew herself up.
You ought to know it,
she said.
But children, unfortunately, never know what is best for them. Amelia and I have always said you were the cleverest child in the school. Will you not do your duty to your poor papa and come home with me?
Sarah took a step forward and toward her, and then stood still. She was thinking of the day when she had been told that she belonged to nobody, and was in danger of being turned out into the street. She was thinking of the cold, hungry hours she had spent alone with Emily and Melchisedec in the attic. She looked at Miss Minchin steadily in the face.
You know why I will not go home with you, Miss Minchin,
she said.
You know quite well.
A hot flush showed itself on Miss Minchin's hard, angry face.
You will never see your companions again,
she began.
I will see that Ermengarde and Lottie are kept away.
Mr. Carmichael stopped her with polite firmness.
Excuse me?
He said.
She will see anyone she wishes to see. The parents of Miss Crewe's fellow pupils are not likely to refuse her invitations to visit her guardian's house. Mr. Carstford will attend to that.
It must be confessed that Miss Minchin flinched. This was worse than the eccentric bachelor uncle who might have had a peppery temper and was easily offended at the treatment of his niece. A woman of sordid mind could easily believe that most people would not refuse to allow their children to remain friends with a little heiress of diamond mines, and if Miss Carrisford chose to tell certain patrons how unhappy Sarah Crewe had been made, many unpleasant things might happen.
You have not undertaken an easy charge,
she said to the Indian gentleman as she turned to leave the room.
You will discover that very soon. The child is neither truthful nor grateful, I suppose,
to Sarah,
that you feel now that you're a princess again.
Sarah looked down and flushed a little, because she thought her pet fancy might not be easy for strangers, even nice ones, to understand at first.
I tried not to be anything else,
she answered in a low voice.
Even when I was coldest and hungriest, I tried not to be.
Now it will not be necessary to try,
said Miss Minchin acidly, as Ramdass sallied her out of the room. She returned home, and going to the sitting-room, sent at once for Miss Amelia. She sat closeted with her all the rest of the afternoon, and it must be admitted that Miss Amelia passed through more than one bad quarter of an hour. She said she shed a good many tears, and mopped her eyes a good deal. One of her unfortunate remarks almost caused her sister to snap her head off entirely, but it resulted in an unusual manner.
I'm not as clever as you, sister,
she said,
and I'm always afraid to say things to you for fear of making you angry, but perhaps if I were not so timid, it would be better for the school and for us both. I must say, as I've often thought, it would be better if you had been less severe on Sarah Crewe, and that she had been decently dressed and was more comfortable. I know she was worked too hard for a child of her age, and I know she was only half fed.
How dare you say such a thing?
exclaimed Miss Minchin.
I don't know how I dare.
Miss Amelia answered with a kind of reckless courage.
But now I have begun, I might as well finish. Whatever happens to me, the child was a clever child, and a good child, and she would have paid you for any kindness you had shown her, but you didn't show her any. The fact was, she was far too clever for you, and you always disliked her for that reason. She used to see through us both.
Amelia!
Gasped her infuriated elder, looking as if she would box her ears and knock her cap off as she had often done to Becky. But Miss Amelia's disappointment had made her hysterical enough not to care what occurred next.
She did,
She cried.
She saw through us both. She saw that you were a hard-hearted, worldly woman, and I was a weak fool, and that we were both of us vulgar and mean enough to grovel on our knees for her money, and behave ill to her because it was taken from her, even though she behaved herself like a little princess, even when she was a beggar. She did, and she did it like a little princess.
And her hysterias got the better of the poor woman, and she began to laugh and cry both at once and rock herself backward and forward.
And now you've lost her,
she cried wildly.
And some other school will get her and her money. And if she were like any other child, she'd tell how she'd been treated, and all our pupils would be taken away, and we should be ruined. And it serves us right, but it serves you more right than it does me. For you are a hard woman, Maria Minchin, a hard, selfish, worldly woman.
And she was in danger of making so much noise with her hysterical chokes and gurgles that her sister was obliged to go to her and apply salts and sal volatile to quiet her, instead of pouring forth her indignation at her audacity. And from that time forward, it may be mentioned, the older Miss Minchin actually began to stand a little in awe of her sister. While she looked so foolish, was evidently not quite so foolish as she looked, and might consequently break out and speak truth people did not want to hear. That evening, when the pupils were gathered together before the fire in the schoolroom, as was their custom before going to bed, Ermengarde came in with a letter in her hand and a queer expression on her round face. It was queer because, while it was an expression of delighted excitement, it combined with such amazement as it seemed to belong to a kind of shock just received.
What is the matter?
Cried 2 or 3 voices at once.
Is it anything to do with the row that's been going on?
Said Lavinia eagerly.
There has been such a row in Miss Minchin's room, and Miss Amelia sounded something like hysterics and has gone to bed.
Ermengarde answered them slowly as if she were half stunned.
I have just had this letter from Sarah,
she said, holding it out to them to let them see what a long letter it was.
From Sarah?
Every voice joined in that exclamation.
Where is she?
Almost shrieked Jessie.
Next door,
said Ermengarde.
With the Indian gentleman.
Where? Has she been sent away? Does Miss Minchin know? What's the row about that? Why did she write? Tell us.
There was a perfect babble, and Lottie began to cry plaintively. Ermengarde answered each of them slowly, as if she were half plunged out into what, at the moment, seemed to be most important and self-explaining thing.
There were diamond mines,
she said stoutly.
There were.
Open mouths and open eyes confronted her.
They were real.
She hurried on.
It was all a mistake about them. Something happened for a time, and Mr. Carrisford thought that they were ruined.
Who's Mr. Carrisford?
Shouted Jessie.
The Indian gentleman, and Captain Crewe thought so too, and he died, and Mr. Carrisford had brain fever and ran away, and he almost died, and he did not know where Sarah was, and turned out there were millions and millions of diamonds in the mine, and half of them belonged to Sarah, and they belonged to her when she was living in the attic, and no one but Melchizedek for a friend, and the cook ordered her about, and Mr. Carrisford found her this afternoon, and he has got her in his home, and she will never come back. She will be more a princess than she ever was, 150,000 times more, and I am going to see her tomorrow afternoon. So there!
Even Miss Minchin herself could scarcely have controlled the uproar after this, and she heard the noise. She did not try. She was not in the mood to face anything more than she was facing in her room. While Miss Amelia was weeping in bed, she knew that the news had penetrated the walls in some mysterious manner, and that every servant and every child would go to bed talking about it. So until almost midnight, the entire seminary, realizing somehow that all the rules were laid aside, crowded around Ermengarde in the schoolroom and heard, read, and reread the letter containing a story which was quite as wonderful as any Sarah herself had ever invented, and which had the amazing charm of having happened to Sarah herself and the mystic Indian gentleman in the very next house. Becky, who heard it also, managed to creep upstairs earlier than usual. She wanted to get away from people and go and look at that little magic room once more. She did not know what would happen next. It was not likely that she would be left to Miss Minchin. It would be taken away, and the attic would be bare and empty again. Glad as she was for Sarah's sake, she went up the last flight of stairs with a lump in her throat and tears blurring her sight. There would be no fire tonight, no rosy lamp, no supper, and no princess sitting in the glowing reading or telling stories, no princess. She choked down a sob as she pushed the attic door open, and then she broke into a low cry. The lamp was flushing the room, the fire was ablaze, the supper was waiting, and Ram Dass was standing smiling into her startled face.
Miss Sahib remembered,
he said.
She told the Sahib all. She wished you to know that good fortune has befallen her. Behold a letter on the tray. She has written. She does not wish you to go to sleep unhappy. Sahib commands that you come to him tomorrow. You are to be the attendant of Mrs. Sahib. Tonight I take all of these things back over the roof.
And having said this with a beaming face, he made a little salaam and slipped through the skylight with an agile slightness of movement which showed Becky how easily he had done it before.
And that is the end of chapter 18. See you next time, readers. Bye for now.
Bye.